Welcome. My name is Kent Hill, and I am Senior Fellow for Eurasia, Middle East, and Islam at the Religious Freedom Institute in Washington, D.C. The Religious Freedom Institute is committed to achieving broad acceptance of the religious liberty as a fundamental human right, as a source of individual and social flourishing, and as the cornerstone of successful society, as well as a driver of national and international security. Religious freedom is important because religion is important, and both religion and religious freedom contribute to human flourishing. RFI is particularly interested in the societal and cultural conditions which either contribute to or undermine religious freedom and undermine the full participation in the definition and the attempt to achieve the common good. Which brings us to the importance of the webinar series we are initiating today. Today is the first of 4 webinars on the topic of truth, virtue, and the common good in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We must begin, however, with an honest assessment of where we find ourselves. Today, in the United States, in Canada, and Europe, there is a widespread and growing skepticism, even despair about finding common ground about what is true and what is good. Old words, phrases, and notions such as natural law, natural rights, human nature, transcendence, virtue, the virtues, the common good, they all seem to be outdated to many. They seem irrelevant, wrong-headed even, or simply impossible to agree upon. There is a painful, even nasty, polarization which infects the body politic and our various cultures. There seems to be a growth in some circles of skepticism that religious voices have something positive to contribute to the debate about the common good. And here is a fundamental question before us, which I hope we can address during this webinar series. Do the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, do they have something to offer to a society unsure of how or whether we can even agree on what is true and what advances the common good? Over the course of the next 3 webinars, we're going to talk with experts from the 3 monotheistic religions about where truth is to be found and how we can determine what is right and wrong. And then there'll be a 4th webinar, which will bring us all back together again to talk about this one last time. I want to introduce to you for a moment my co-host, my co-moderator for these webinars, my esteemed colleague, Ismail, the director of the Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team. Ismail, would you like to make a few comments before I introduce Dr. Finnis?
Well, I just want to say first, in the name of God, the most gracious, most merciful. So we're very excited here at RFI to bring this webinar series to you, and of course, it's a great blessing and pleasure, Kent, that we'll have this opportunity to engage with these profound and very, very meaningful and very, in fact, practical at the end of the day ideas. So I'll hand it back to you, and looking forward to this conversation.
Yes, thanks, Ismail. We look forward to your questions a little later in the conversation. It's now my distinct honor, my great honor, to introduce Dr. John Finnis. Dr. John Finnis is one of the most respected scholars in the world on moral, political, and legal theory, and also on common law, constitutional law. He is a fellow of the philosophy and the law sections of the esteemed British Academy. He taught law and philosophy for 45 years in Oxford University, after going there from Australia as a Rhodes Scholar. But he also taught for 25 years at the University of Notre in Indiana, ending this last year 10 years after his retirement from Oxford. He will be co-teaching a graduate course in political and legal theory at Oxford University this next term. Dr. Finnis, we're so honored to have you here. And I want to pose a question to get us started here. In light of the considerable evidence of the growing and even the bitter polarization in our societies, compounded by even an increasing despair that a common good or ground can be secured amidst all our diversity, could you perhaps offer some thoughts from a Christian perspective on how to pursue what is true, what is right and wrong, and how we can do that together, even if we don't share the same religious beliefs, or perhaps don't profess religious belief at all?
Yes, thank you very much, Kent, for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to be, and a privilege for me to have it. The fact is, I think that we can pursue truth together, because we do very extensively pursue truth together. And I'd like to come back later on to the causes, or as I see them, of the polarization and also of the skepticism, because the fact is that there's a huge amount of common ground in our culture, in our civilization, in the practice of it, about the availability of truth and of our ability to attain truth, especially, of course, in matters of science, natural science. The success of the natural sciences over the last few hundred years is the success of searches for truth and of sharing of the results of those searches amongst a wide set of circles amounting to a culture, amounting to a civilization of what we call science, but science means knowledge of truth, pursued as a good by those engaged in the research, in the search for knowledge. So everyone, in fact, whether when they're philosophizing, recognizes it or not, everyone, in fact, regards truth as a good, knowledge of truth as a human good, as something to be valued, something that we're in bad shape if we don't succeed in attaining, if we're muddled, if we're ignorant, if we're confused and superstitious, then we are not sharing in truth, and we feel and we know that that's a bad way to be. So that's something we all do in fact share, and we can build on that. We can build on the recognition that there is at least one truth that we all value and regard as objectively, truly a good. Now, there's something further. If anyone is engaged in scientific or historical or such like research into facts, they can, we can, anyone can, one can, with a modest amount of reflection, realize that there are temptations. There are temptations to cheat, to shut your eyes to the evidence, to muffle the results, and so forth. And these temptations are to do something that is wrong, to cheat oneself in the first instance, and then possibly to cheat one's colleagues, to deceive them, or to deceive those to whom one communicates what one says are one's results. So everyone on reflection recognizes some standards of right and wrong in research. So that's something that we need. We need sound, honest research, and it's not our only need. We need to be alive and well to pursue research, and not just to pursue research, but to participate in all the other goods of life. So there's knowledge, and there's life and health, but there are the goods of friendship, of harmonious association, in which the other person's well-being is valued like one's own well-being. Cheating oneself is bad for oneself. Cheating one's colleague, one's associate, one's friend in the work, and possibly just one's straightforward friend is a bad thing. So friendship is a good. And these are not the only fundamental goods, but they are the core of a list, a bit longer, of fundamental human goods, valued for their own sake. And what we call a civilization or a culture is an organization to pursue and protect and foster and communicate to the next generation that set of human goods, basic human goods. Talk about another generation, of course, introduces a further fundamental good, and that's the association of two people who can produce a member of a new generation, a woman and a man, who can together produce a child and be committed to bringing up that child as a participant, a sharer in human goods. So there's another basic good of marriage, family, the procreative friendship of the two people who can have children. So already, I think it's clear if you just start with something that's entirely common ground, it's clear that there is a lot of common ground, and that the despair about truth about good is coming from other sources than, in a sense, the problem itself. The problem itself is one that the problem of participating in knowledge of a common good is something that we already, in a sense, have solved by being together in a society at all. Because what I've been talking about as human goods, knowledge, truth, friendship, life, marriage, these are each common. They're in principle available to everyone. They're in that sense common. They're good for me, they're good for you, they're good for anyone that we can think of as a human being. That's not all that we mean by the common good or a common good or the common good of a particular group. So there's a second meaning of common good, the good of a group, of a set of people who are in some sense cooperating. So that's another sense of common good. But it too is based on this sort of deeper sense of common good, namely that we all share in the way of being for which these are fundamental goods. These knowledge, life, friendship, marriage, etc. So there's a set of ideas about common good. I just want to add, before we get a little bit further, is that I've already also introduced the idea of right and wrong. Cheating in research is wrong. It's a wrong to oneself in the first instance if one cheats oneself by just getting the results one wanted to get and not the results that are justified by the data. So there's a standard of right and wrong that's a standard we can't deny. We can choose to ignore it. We can choose to do the wrong of cheating ourselves or others. But we can't deny that it's a wrong. And also, as a matter of fact, we can't deny that we have the choice to do wrong. We know the temptation. We know that it's real. We know that we can succumb to it. So there, whether we like it or not, is another truth that we share, namely that there's free choice. Not that everything we do is freely chosen, but that there are free choices for us in a strong sense of free. So there's a lot to build on, and the causes of confusion about these truths, philosophical truths, if you like, about right and wrong and about common goods and about common good of particular groups. The causes of these confusions is something that perhaps we can get onto.
Dr. Finnis, listening to you talk, I can't help but ask myself from a Christian point of view, the sort of the theological basis for the optimism. There's a certain optimism in what you said, this firm belief that there is a way for all of us, despite our diversity, to work together, to find common ground. And I, of course, immediately think of Genesis and the Christian theological position that all people, not just Jews, all people are created in the image of God. And from that, for us, springs the notion of human dignity. And what it says basically is that there is a way built into the structure of the universe for honest people. I mean, anybody can forge research, but for honest people, there is a way to agree about many things regarding what the nature of reality is and truth, etc. There is one question, however, that comes up sometimes. When you talk about the origin of conscience, or the origin of a sense of right and wrong, or used to be, we talked a bit more about natural law or natural reason, not so much now. But there are those who are very afraid that these notions are somehow unstable, even malleable, too malleable, if they're not rooted in assumptions about the nature of ultimate reality that you often find in the monotheistic religions. Do you think notions like conscience and reason, a common sense of certain virtues being good, do you think those realities, that conscience, can withstand not being rooted in transcendence?
Well, they can, just as science can be pursued by people who have no philosophical confidence that the world is ultimately real, or is ultimately explicable, or is ultimately intelligible, and not a matter of random sensations. So there are a lot of false philosophies out there, and sometimes people who are highly successful scientists or researchers or historians hold these beliefs and yet do successful science and so on, which contradict the philosophical beliefs that they have. So what I think is important is that knowledge and truth are something that is, you might say, naturally available to rational beings, even when those beings, though it might be you or me, don't have any confidence ultimately in the source of the reality and intelligibility that they are taking for granted in their practice. So you can be a successful physicist without accepting or realizing that there is a source of the intelligibility of the physical world, and that ultimate source is something beyond the physical world, a transcendent mind and will, mind to conceive a world that makes physical sense, and will to bring it into being and sustain it in being. Now, there is also the foundation of our own capacity to understand. And when you talk about conscience and sense of conscience and so forth, I think you're really talking about our ability to understand what's good, what's right, what's wrong, what's humanly bad, and so forth. We call it conscience when we're thinking not simply abstractly, but practically about options that we have or that anyone has. So you can think prospectively about what it would be good to do or wrong to do. You can think retrospectively about choices you did make in the past and recognize them as having been wrongful choices. That's another aspect of conscience. But both these aspects of conscience are simply a name, in fact, a Christian name that is on the lips of St. Paul and St. Peter, for this capacity to understand the rightness or wrongness of one's options. So I wouldn't think of conscience as a special sense, an additional sense. It's our reason, our intelligence operating in a reflective way, practical but reflective, about our options. And when we talk about, you mentioned the image of God, we're again talking about our what we share with God, namely an ability to understand a set of possibilities as desirable and to bring them into being by a free choice. That's ultimately the explanation of the existence and intelligibility of the whole universe in its entirety. A personal being beyond the universe, beyond its entropy, its decay, its evolution, its flourishing, decline, etc., beyond all that, beyond change, and yet capable of bringing all that into being and sustaining it. So there is the source of not only the universe but of conscience. And my optimism is not optimism in the starry-eyed sense of denying some aspects of reality. I fully recognize the sources of skepticism and the prevalence of skepticism, but I sounded optimistic because I just made some recollection, introduced a recollection of what we actually are doing successfully, namely carrying on a civilization of science and historical critical learning on a grand scale in dedication to truth.
Ismail, I wonder if you might have a question you would like to pose.
Yes, Dr. Finnis, in light of what you've discussed, it raised a lot of questions in my mind. Often when we debate with atheists, when I debate with atheists, I'll cite Dostoevsky's statement that without God, all is permitted. So he posited that without a transcendent grounding, there can be no real morality or no stable grounding for morality. And I don't want to oversimplify Dostoevsky, but that's what I take from that statement. And then Nietzsche, on the other hand, held that that there is no God and that therefore right and wrong is merely will to power, and that those who had abandoned God but still clung to Christian morality were in reality just stuck to this slave morality, as he called it. And postmodernists followed him in this to some extent. And then others hold that morality, even the golden rule, can be based on self-interest alone. Often in debates with atheists, they'll say things like, well, I follow the golden rule because if we didn't do that, then there could be no civilization. And it's good for me personally if I follow the golden rule. And yet there's a sense, as you mentioned, that right and wrong, notions of right and wrong are sort of can be arrived at by reason. So as much as there seems to be something very true in what Dostoevsky said, but on the other hand, as you said, knowledge and truth are available to rational human beings. And I would also add that in Islam, we believe that this knowledge of right and wrong is imprinted on the souls of all of us, which is the concept of fitra, the inborn nature, which we can forget as we get older. But Augustine and Plato I believe there's a analogy there with the concept of anamnesis, or remembering things that we knew when before we embodied this physical plane. So could you discuss how you might respond on the one hand to the notion that without God there can be no morality, or that non-believers are just clinging to remnants of Christian morality, or that self-interest could be a basis for morality?
Well, that's quite a package to take on Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and the postmodernist and the utilitarian, as it were, or so it's egoistic skeptics. But I'm happy to. I think Dostoevsky's. I think he was a better novelist than a philosopher. I think that saying of his is actually rather confused. If God didn't exist, well, we're off base already, because God must exist.
Yeah.
So what's possible is that people don't recognize that necessity. Yeah. And so then he's hinting that someone who doesn't recognize it is somehow disqualified from making judgments of right and wrong. But why? As a matter of fact, it's not true. There are plenty of wicked atheists, but there are plenty of honest atheists who are simply, you might say, inconsistent in their reasoning about reality, but not necessarily inconsistent in their reasoning about right and wrong. Mm-hmm. Now, St. Paul says that if you deny the truths about the creation and providential sustaining of the universe, you are very likely to fall into vice. And I believe that's true. He wasn't making the same claim as Dostoevsky, but one in the neighborhood, which I think is actually truer. But St. Paul wasn't claiming that this is inevitable. It's just that there's a temptation to resort to egoism, to flip down your list to the bottom. The egoist who says he subscribes to the golden rule because it pays off for him in the long run, is telling us what they don't usually want to tell us, namely that when the chips are down, if it comes to it, I'll let you down.
Yes.
I'll disobey the golden rule and treat you as I wouldn't want you to treat me, because after all, it's all for me. Mm-hmm. And of course, atheists don't usually find it to their advantage to tell us that they're in the end not going to cooperate. They're going to betray us. So there's a problem about egoism. There are several problems about egoism. One is that cuts you off from friendship, because if you tell the truth about yourself, namely that you're an egoist, you've said, I can't be your friend. I can be your socializer and enjoy a drink with you, but I'm not going to be your friend. And that's a huge loss. So egoism is a kind of amputation of the self. It's also a denial of the truth, because the truth that we easily all see is that, for example, coming to know something simple you learned when you were 6 or 7 in class, and you're sitting there and you realize for the first time that there's such a thing as knowledge and ignorance, and that knowledge is good and ignorance is bad, and getting the answer that the teacher gives or that you think out for yourself is a good thing. As you come to understand that, you come to understand that it's just as good for the boy or girl in the next desk as it is for you. Nothing special about oneself that makes it good. And so what's good for me is good for you at this basic level of fundamental shared common goods, is a truth that the egoist has to work to deny, has to find reasons to deny, and good reasons are not available to sustain his position. Nietzsche, it's very, very good to take oneself in the first instance, and then one's students through Nietzsche on the origins of conscience. And not so much for his theories of punishment, although they're not negligible, that he expounds in the course of telling us where our conscience came from, but to see how he plays around with the idea that truth is a good. So Nietzsche's skepticism about truth is contradicted by his search for truth. And when he announces that he's going to treat truth like an assassin, again, it's like the egoist's announcement. It's incoherent with what he actually values. And in the end, I think it's what drove him over the edge. The radical inconsistency of his own position about the good of truth and the rightness of valuing it and the wrongness of cheating. So I don't know about anamnesis. I'm skeptical that we had a pre-existence. In fact, I think that's a mistake.
Mm-hmm.
But what we think of and what Plato and others thought of as anamnesis is I think, a sort of first shot at explaining the amazing fact that from an early age we can understand that the world and its intelligibility and other people's thoughts and their intelligibility to us, that all this is so is an amazing fact, and tempting to say, oh, well, I'm just remembering what I already knew. Discovery, insight, the original first coming to understand is, I think, the bottom for us. It's the bottom line. And it's an amazing fact that I would explain as a God-given capacity that we have to take what we don't understand, data that we don't understand, evidence, etc., and understand it originally from no prior understanding of it.
Amazing.
I ask myself the question of what monotheists in particular, Jews and Christians and Muslims, might have to offer that's particularly vital or necessary or useful to the current state of sort of skepticism about finding the common good. It strikes me that even the witness of these religions to the possibility that we all believe because of the way we view God, the possibility of reason and conscience pointing us in the right direction and not just invariably in a selfish direction, is a word of hope that these religions can offer. But I'm reminded, I think it was in Lincoln's first inaugural address when he made reference to our better angels. Well, if he talks about our better angels, you can assume that he's also understanding that we all have angels that are not better, that there's some kind of struggle going on in us. Religion tries to deal with that to some degree, the notion that, well, we may have a conscience as I should do this, I should be generous, I should help that person in trouble. But another part of us says they want to keep our toys. We want to keep our assets. And so this conflict, this moral conflict, which seems to be uniquely part of the human condition, religion tries to address. And I guess one question I have is, when we think of what the monotheistic religions and Christianity today we're talking about has to particularly offer, beyond the hope that there is something that matters, there's something there that matters in terms of conscience, but maybe is there something more that we offer in terms of saying, if we look at the world, the way it's constructed, we're just not going to be happy, like Augustine pointed out, until we find our peace in something other than just material things. That message that we won't be fulfilled as human beings without coming to terms with this, does that unleash the power to be more virtuous or to grow in virtue as a sense of obligation to the Creator, as something, the only thing that's really going to allow us to be fulfilled, to be sons and daughters of God?
Well, Kent, I don't think I would start with the idea of what will make us happy, because I think a good part of the dignified part of modern skepticism says well, I just want the truth. I don't want what will make me happy. And if the truth is going to make me unhappy, well, I'd rather have the truth. So I'm not sure that that's the way into this problem of widespread skepticism about foundations. Incidentally, going back to the beginning, the better angel, that was a quotation from Shakespeare, a sonnet. And whatever one's views about the proper interpretation of the sonnets, it's clear to me, having worked on Shakespeare in recent decades, that Shakespeare was a Christian and indeed I'd say a Catholic, and I've published works expounding some of his poems, for example, and plays to bring to light what hasn't been noticed about that before. Anyway, what Shakespeare's Christian belief, I think, contributes greatly to his humanism, to his ability to comprehend the human condition and human social conditions across the vast scale that he does, and to appreciate its beauty and its ugliness and communicate all that in a way that's beautiful, and that he values for its beauty, and that he wants and expects his audience to value for the beauty of the language and of the plotting and of the historical references and so forth. All that, I think, is greatly aided by his faith. Now, I think that the aid that Christianity gives and that is given to some degree by any religious belief that has found its way one way or another through to an acknowledgement of creation and an acknowledgement of the possibility that God will communicate information to us directly rather than indirectly. I mean, God greatly communicates greatly to us indirectly by establishing an intelligible world and giving us the intelligence to understand it. The modern biological concept of information is very, very similar to the classical philosophical Aristotelian Platonic idea of form. And I think the truth about creation is that it is essentially light plus information, which at the outset gives you the Big Bang and the origins of the universe. Then further information at a certain point, billions of years down the road, information that enables all this matter and form to become also living. That's a huge step, an injection, so to speak, of a new level of information. And then billions of years later, the injection of a further set of form of information, intelligent life, rational life. Now, Christianity offers a further source of information, building on the revelation to the people of Israel. It introduces a historical figure who tells us of a further and final injection of information, the offer and availability of eternal life. That's the essence of the good news of the Christian gospel. Mm-hmm. So that clearly has a big implication. Right. Alignment of one's will, one's choices, with the creative divine will is the foundation by God's pure gift of a possible sharing in God's eternal life. Now that gives a further motivation for doing what already one has, in some sense, a sufficient motivation for, that is, living honestly and justly in line with the virtues and resisting and rejecting the temptation to egoism and other forms of unreasonableness in choice. but it's something that, as I say, is not absolutely necessary for a just life, but is a supremely attractive opportunity and motivation for persevering in such a life.
Just to pursue this a little bit, I take your point completely that to use the word happiness to begin the conversation doesn't get at what we're talking about here. You're quite right. Maybe something like to assert that true fulfillment of our beings will only come from bringing our lives into conformity with some things that are sometimes very hard to accept, involves conduct that's hard to live by, but in the end, it's the only thing that will achieve true meaning. This is something uniquely that a human being might experience, and it's the question of short-term pleasure versus a long-term sense of real meaning and fulfillment in life. The story is often told about the person who is given an opportunity. If they'll just be dishonest or compromise, they can have tremendous power or wealth, and they find it within themselves or with God's help to do the right thing. They remain or become poor, or they risk their lives because they do the right thing. And they say at the end of the day, well, I'm not powerful. I may not even live long. And there's going to be real pain from this, but I can sleep at night. I've done the right thing. There's a sense in us that we long to be in conformity with something that's more important than just meeting our material needs or our desires for power, etc. I mean, the old debate about whether we believe in God and therefore try to discern truth and just try to discern what we're to do, or we believe that we ourselves decide what is right and wrong for what will, make what we perceive make us happy or something. From a religious point of view, we not only disagree with the latter, but we say that's not likely to bring you what you think it's going to bring you. It's likely to bring disharmony to your own lives and to society's life. And that debate about whether there is a truth out there that we try to discern or that we're just the product of everything as if we're little gods, that seems to be a lot of the debate in the modern world about who makes this call. Is there even a morality out there to discern, or is this not just something we decide? We decide who we are, what we want, what we will do.
Well, this isn't a peculiarly modern question. It's a question that Plato takes up in a number of his dialogues, the Gorgias, for example, but the Republic is the one that frames the issue more or less as you did. So the young men say to Socrates, show us that it's right, sensible, reasonable, acceptable to be just, by which they mean someone who makes the right choices in their own life, dealing with others as well. But is it right? Does it make sense to be a just person, even if it'll bring you to crucifixion?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and Socrates says, okay, I'll give you the answer, and it takes 6 or 7 books, and in book 9, he gives you the answer. Now, and then there's book 10. Now, in book 9, the answer is, well, the soul of the whole construction of a set of cities and so forth is not about politics ultimately, but about the answer to this question, a very individual question. But the soul of the successful tyrant is the soul of a man who is failing because his life is one of terrors and illusions. He has no friends. His friends are all people who might murder him. And so his inner life is one of buzzing confusion and in a very obvious sense of unhappiness. That's Socrates' official answer, and it's a good answer. Rightness and wrongness in one's choices, organized, so to speak, consistently as what we call a life of virtues and virtue, and Plato works all that out in the course of the dialogue. That is a life that makes sense and is fulfilling, and if you like, gives you a kind of inner happiness that is not available to the life of the person who systematically cheats on others and defies justice. Now, to that, I think successful enough answer, Plato adds the great vision of final judgment in the last book, and he presents it as a myth, as a story that was told by somebody to somebody, and it's a story, but it's a story of a divine judgment in which those who lived justly are rewarded and those who lived unjustly suffer a radical ultimate penalty by divine dispensation. Now, that's a myth in Plato. The Christian faith says it's also the reality. It's not one thought up by philosophers, but it's one communicated to us authoritatively and convincingly by a man who was truly a man, but truly God, and so knew what God has in mind for this astonishing creation of his, prepared over billions of years in the stages that I outlined. Or each stage, as it were, inconceivable from the point of view of the previous stage. If you were in the previous stage, there's no way you could, so to speak, envisage life. And from the point of view of just life, the idea of rational life is inconceivable. Yeah. So there's, I think, the sort of structure of our situation is we've got a civilization to which has been formed decisively 2,000 years ago by the injection of this new level of information called the revelation in Christ. And now, after several centuries of partly through misunderstandings, partly not through misunderstanding, several centuries of rejection of that revelation, the fruits of the rejection flow back into the rejection. Can't be contained by simply asserting that the revelation is false. Reasons have to be given, and those reasons, which are essentially bad reasons, then chip away at, undermine, in the end, wash away any at least philosophical grasp of the natural truths of natural reason about of knowledge of reality and of right and wrong, independent of revelation. Right. So we're in a civilization which is highly confused about its own history, defiant in the face of its own history, and suffering from the consequences of these confusions and defiances of evidence and reality.
Ismail, would you pose the next question?
Yes, Professor Finnis, building on what you discussed there, can you give us an understanding of what the virtues are in Christianity? And I don't mean enumerating them, but I mean just the concept of the virtues. And you touched on that a great deal with the discussion of justice, for example. And how do Christians understand them? And how do they flow from truth and reality? And what is their relationship to morality writ large? And what is their relationship to divine law, the commandments?
Well, the language of virtues is a Greek philosophical language. It's in Plato and his successors, Aristotle, but the Stoics and others. And the early Christians gladly adopted that, along with a huge amount of the philosophical achievements of the previous 600 or 700 years and more. And it's just one way of talking about a set of dispositions. So a virtue is a disposition to make right choices. A disposition, what's a disposition? It's not exactly a bare capacity. And it's not exactly the acting on that capacity, but it's, so to speak, in between the bare capacity and the actualization of that capacity. So it's a bit like one's knowledge of arithmetic, say, of the multiplication table. That's a disposition to answer the question, what's 7 times 7, correctly and promptly. Everyone has the capacity to learn what 7 times 7 is, but only those who've learned the table know what the answer is. They've then got the disposition, and there they can activate it after maybe 30 years of never thinking about what 7 times 7 is, and then someone asks and they can give the answer. So that's the activation of the disposition and ultimately of the capacity. So virtue is a disposition, in that sense of disposition, to make choices that are reasonable, that are fair, that are just. That now then, what other virtues? Plato gives the list of 4 virtues in the Republic, and it's a good list. It's proved totally serviceable, and so to speak, at the top of the list is something that's hard to give a good name to. I call it practical reasonableness. Out there in the culture, it's called prudence, but that prudence on the modern lips tends to mean the opposite of that. It means a kind of egoism. But a prudent decision in an idiomatic way is not just egoistic. It's one that is attentive to reality. So practical reasonableness, or prudentia, or phronesis in Plato's language, is in charge of all the virtues. It so to speak, it stands for your capacity and disposition to sort out what is right and wrong, and not just to sort it out, but to be disposed to live by it. And then justice, which means right and wrong in relation to other people, and then temperance or moderation in mastering one's emotions and desires, especially desire to consume this and so forth, and courage. The courage to resist the temptation to flee from difficulties when flight would be contrary to practical reasonableness, for example, by being contrary to justice. And that's the package which, when unfolded, gives you the complete list of virtues. These are the swing door hinge virtues, the cardinal virtues. And that's a good example of Christianity's taking over and adopting and internalizing and running with what was already out there philosophically and culturally. And I think building on well. That's what I'd say about virtues.
How about their relationship with the law, particularly with divine law, the commandments and so on? Because we hear a lot about the supposed clash between virtue ethics and deontological ethics or rules-based ethics. But in the Christian view, is there really a clash between the virtues and the divine law?
Absolutely not, because when I say it's a disposition to choose rightly or wrongly, there must be some standards by which we judge with our practical reasonableness what is right and what's wrong. So the standards by which we identify error are analogous to standards, the rules of arithmetic or the rules of data collection and so forth. Right. That are just standards of right and wrong in a field. Now here the field is the whole open horizon of one's existence. It's not a technical field. Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas begin their discussion of ethics of morality by distinguishing technical problems from moral problems. A technical problem is one where you've got some definite aim, and the issue is to find effective means to achieve it. The moral problem is where you don't have a definite aim yet, except to decide what definite aims to have. So you've got the open horizon in which you could do anything, from commit suicide in the next 5 minutes to anything. Now, what do I do? It's not a technical problem. It's the moral problem, and everyone faces it all the time. And every use of a technique, of a technical skill, is also a moral choice, to spend part of one's life doing that rather than doing something else. So that's morality, and it has standards, because one can, just as one can make mistakes in any technical art or field, so one can make mistakes, misjudgments, errors, and commit wrongs in the field of choosing in this open horizon of the whole of human life. And the errors that amount to injustice are very obvious, but even when there's no one else at stake except oneself, the possibility of error, like the decision to simply commit suicide because one feels like it, or would enjoy drinking oneself to death, those are obvious moral mistakes, where the wrong is against the virtue of temperance and of practical reasonableness, and it's a terrible wrong, even though no one else perhaps is involved. One's wrecked on a desert island, will never see anyone again. One can still live well or live badly morally on a desert island.
The unfortunate fact is that our time is just about gone, and so I'm going to have to bring this to a close, but I just might make a few quick observations. We had begun today thinking a little bit about the reality of the fact that, at least in many circles, there's some concern that we seem to be flying apart, finding it more difficult to agree on the common good. There's almost an assumption that we're too different. Religions are different. Non-religious folks don't think religious folks have access to the truth, etc. And one of the things I take away from this conversation with Dr. Finnis is that we need to be very careful not to succumb to despair. We need to affirm the continued importance of reason and conscience, which are the gifts of every human being. If religions, if in this case Christianity, affirms that fact, affirms that it's not just them, not just Christians who have access to these gifts of God, and also the gift of God of human dignity to think and to respond to conscience and reason. That's an important message, and I think it's a message we may well hear from our Jewish colleagues and our Muslim colleagues as well. But it is important, I think, to be reminded of the fact that conscience and reason can help us build the common good. And yet it's also obvious that you can say all of that and you're still left with great divisions. And the monotheists and Christians and Jews and Muslims continually need to ask themselves, what is it they bring to the table? I used to work at USAID and international development, and I remember in a fragile situation where there'd been a civil war, you try to make rational arguments about what you should do after the conflict, but the bitterness and the hate were so profound that no argument that says for the good of the children you need to forgive would really work. And sometimes the only voices in that culture, that society, that could make an argument against what was so powerful, the bitterness and anger about the past, were the religious voices who said, no, you simply must forgive. That's something that doesn't come easily, even looking reason straight in the face. And so we need to ask ourselves the question, in pursuit of the virtues, in pursuit of the good, what is it that religion has to contribute? And finally, maybe the observation, all of this should make it perfectly clear that in the debate within society about what the good is, religious and non-religious voices all must be present for that discussion. None should be ruled out because that's our common heritage as citizens and as human beings to contribute to the discussion and the actualization of what will promote the common good. So let me end by thanking Dr. Finnis for his time today. It's been really wonderful, and my colleague Ismail. And I want to remind our viewers, and by the way, we had an overwhelming response to this. Well over 100 people signed up to do this, and many more will see it after the fact. But this next Tuesday, we're having the second installment of this with Rabbi David Novak at 11 o'clock on Tuesday, December the 8th, Eastern Time. And we'd like you and any of your colleagues or friends to tune into that as well. And we will have a third with a Muslim expert in the coming weeks, and then bring us all back together. So once again, thank you, Dr. Finnis. Thank you to all
Thank you so much.
tuned in on this, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless you.